because the deeper orientation requires that the sacrum move and the lumbar spine moves.
Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Strong Monday. Coming off of a cool day yesterday. So yesterday was Mother's Day. My mom is 88. We had the entire family together for the first time, I think, in over a year. So that was kind of cool and good for her. So I hope you had the opportunity to appreciate your mom. Little housekeeping. IFAST-U Q&A from last week is posted for those of you who are iFast University members. If you're not a member, please go to ifastuniversity.com and get yourself signed up for that. Let's dig right into today's Q&A. Today's Q&A is with Jordan. Jordan is a regular on the Thursday morning, 6 a.m. Thursday morning coffee and coaches conference calls. He's also a physical therapy student. And so he had a really good question in regards to some of the narrow ISA foundational archetype representations. So gaining some clarity with that. We also kind of led into how we may influence some of the early and late representations of external rotation. And we made reference to actually one of the squat activities that we use to sort of recapture that. So again, adding clarity to the archetype and then how we're going to move into those early and late representations. So very cool. If you still have questions about those concepts, this is going to be a great call for you. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute Q&A with yours truly, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, put 15-minute consultation in the subject line so I don't delete it, and we will arrange that at our mutual convenience. Everybody have an outstanding Monday, and I will see you tomorrow.
We are recording. Timer has started. Jordan, what is your question?
So I think I've been getting so caught up in wide ISAs just because I've worked with athletes, and I think it just so happens we've been talking a lot about wide ISA people, I think. And so I've just been focusing on that. And I was going back through some old stuff, and I was just switching my gear to like narrow ISAs, a lot with like Zach talking about his ACL patients and whatnot. And I had to go through that. And I just wanted to run it by you. My first question is for your narrow ISAs. The initial presentation is going to be lower posterior compartment is compressed, correct?
Okay, so let's clarify this because I think there is some confusion in this regard. So we have to look at the shape. All right. So when we look at an inhaled representation of the pelvis, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about a counternutated representation. But let's not confuse this with someone that has a superficial compressive strategy in the posterior lower aspect of the pelvis, because that's not the same thing. So the diaphragm shape, okay, as you breathe in, has expansion in the anterior aspect of the outlet. Okay, so the relative position posteriorly is not expanded. So rather than saying compressed, it is, but let's just say that it's not expanded under those circumstances, because we want to differentiate between a posterior lower compressive strategy, which is superficial, relative to this, and we could call it a normal inhaled representation of the pelvis first and foremost. So that's where we're starting from when we're talking about the foundational representation of the narrow ISA archetype. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So as long as you're clear on that, because essentially what it is, it's the position just doesn't allow that area to expand as you breathe in. So we get an anterior expansion on that inhalation, or actually in the exhaled compensatory strategy that starts this whole process of the narrow ISA's behaviors from that point forward, is that anterior aspect is where that expansion persists. So even on the exhale, they still have the anterior expansion.
Okay. And so then the domino effect of what will happen with their ADLs and their training will typically follow that superficial musculature pattern.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But understand that the sequence of events is a little bit different because with your wide ISAs, their first response to the compensatory strategy in regards to breathing is that they're going to get pushed backwards. So their response is to push back forward. Whereas with your narrow ISAs, because they trap air anteriorly, the expansion is forward, so they fall forward first. So their first superficial compensatory strategy is going to be to push back. So that's the differentiator between the two. And then, of course, then you've got this sort of ping pong effect of anterior to posterior compressive strategies to maintain center of gravity. And then whatever resultant, wherever they are in space under those circumstances, that determines what we end up measuring or observing during movement.
Okay, that makes sense because you lose that internal rotation initially, I guess. I don't know, relatively first, I guess.
As soon as they compress anteriorly, yes, you're going to start to lose the internal rotation, because they still have posterior expansion under those circumstances. In fact, I'm kind of forcing it under those circumstances where I'm pushing from the front. I have expansion posteriorly that maintains my ER representation, but I'm losing IRs under the circumstance.
Okay, and then this is perfect leading way. So that then what will follow that is once they're pushed back, they'll do some sort of ping pong to counter that. So that's when you'll start to see that dumping, that anterior orientation.
Right. So think about the initial counter-nutated representation. So I should have that expansion at the base of the sacrum, which would bring the lumbar spine with it if we're just talking about the pelvis, or I would have that expansion where I would see dorsal rostral expansion under those circumstances. But then as the superficial strategies are applied and I start to see that change in orientation, that's where I'm going to start to see the anterior orientation show up in a narrow, because they get it too. They just, again, it's just that the sequence is a little bit different.
Okay. I think that was what was tripping me up. Now, I think what was really confusing me, I guess it'll be different in terms of when you sequence certain exercises, but I saw some you did like with a banded around the knees, like your classic, like through the excursion, but you've also done a squat or like a hook line with the ball in between the knees. I get the hook line one where you're opening the posterior lower. Yep. The band around the knees, though, through the squat, I'm a little bit confused. Can you clarify that?
So you have to think about where we are in space because they're not in the same place. So when I'm in hook lying and you look at the amount of hip bending that you have, totally different from the squat.
Okay.
So what we're doing with the band in the deep squat. So as I gain depth, and if I have the anterior orientation, all that musculature above the trochanter is going to be biased towards internal rotation. Okay, so if I'm trying to improve the descent, so I'm trying to increase the depth of my squat to capture that early representation, I have to eliminate the influence of that internal rotation. Otherwise, I won't capture the depth that I want, and I won't get the diaphragm position that I want. So by fixing the femurs, so I'm not pushing out against the resistance. I'm holding my position against the resistance. What that does is it's an ER force, which means that as I descend and that anterior orientation becomes this influence of IR, if I'm resisting, then I reduce the IR influence. So it's that musculature, okay, is less likely to produce the internal rotation at that point. And then that allows me to eccentrically orient and descend. So I'm going to capture, so the musculature that's pushing me forward, compressing the base of the sacrum will release its concentric orientation, right? Because I've got the ER force. Okay, so it's going to allow the sacrum to tilt backwards in the depth of the squat, so it can actually capture the early representation of the deep squat.
So basically, you're not necessarily creating space; you're maintaining space for that internal rotation to kind of.
If I am compressing the base of the sacrum forward as I descend into the deepest part of a squat, there is no way for me to descend that diaphragm to allow that to occur. Okay. Because of the anti-orientation, it just can't happen. So I have to reduce the concentric orientation of that IR-ing musculature. Okay. So the band creates an ER demand to be maintained throughout. So it allows the sacrum to counter-nutate at the of the deep squat.
That makes, now I get it now.
It's sneaky. It's really sneaky because traditionally what people have done is they say, oh, you need to push out and push more iron. It's like, yeah, I get that. But what I'm going to end up doing though, is I'm going to create a late propulsive strategy under those, like if I actively ER at the hip, right? I'm going to push outward to create that ER space out there, but that's going to push the pelvis forward, and that becomes a late propulsive strategy. Well, I got late at the top of the squat. I want early at the bottom of the squat, right? So I can't push out because again, that's propelling me forward. I need to create the delay strategy at the bottom. So I have to have expansion at the base of the sacrum, right? I have to be able to yield under those circumstances. And if I can't do that, then I don't descend into the squat in a early representation, because that's my goal with the band.
Yeah.
You see the difference?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly.
And then my next question in relation to this, when I think of like deep squat, my initial thought was like heels elevated, right? Mm-hmm. But I know you've talked about for those narrows, like you got to be careful, because I guess that you mentioned like hiding the $100 bill.
Yep.
Can you go over that? Because I feel like with the band, if you combine that, wouldn't that help with the heels elevated, or is it going to be counterintuitive?
Okay, so let's be very, very clear on what the goal is. So is the goal to acquire best depth, which would be the early representation of the pelvis in the deep squat? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the foot representation first. So we're very, very clear on what we mean by a heels elevated representation. So what I want to have is the foot on the foot on the platform, if you will. All right. So it's one platform, because if I just have the heel elevated and I have the toes extended, I put myself in a late representation, which means that I won't get the yielding action that I want in the bottom of the squat. So that's step number one. Okay. Clarify me for the second half of the question now. So
I was thinking for like, you were talking about using a band around the knees to help them get deeper.
Yep.
But then you've also talked about when you like combining those two exercises. However, I think you explained in the past that you get that like hiding the $100 bill example.
Right. So you got to be careful with this. Okay. Because what some folks will do when you're cueing pelvic position as they're descending into the squat, what some people will do is because they're at the top, and that is a later representation in regard to pelvic orientation. So the foot's going to bias us towards the early, but I can still create that posterior lower compressive strategy as they're posteriorly orienting. So if I have somebody that's anteriorly oriented and you're cueing posterior orientation, you got to be very, very careful that they're not closing that posterior outlet actively, which pushes them forward into that late representation. Because if they hang on to that at the bottom of the squat, there's no way that they're going to be able to sit down. And so again, that might require you to do like the hook lying activity first, like we talked about before, where I have to be able to cue them out of that posterior lower concentric orientation. And so the way that you'll know that you've got it, that you've alleviated that, is I'm going to recapture my early range hip flexion. I'm going to recapture my straight leg raise, and I'm going to pick up some internal rotation at that traditional 90 degrees of where we test our ER and IR at 90 degrees of traditional hip flexion. So if I pick up, and you won't necessarily get full internal rotation. So again, we're looking for an early representation, which will not have full internal rotation, but you will have a measure of it. So for instance, if we were looking at let's just say that it was 40 degrees of traditional IR would consider the average. You might have 20, and then you've got enough to capture that early representation. You follow?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So your understanding of the strategy for that early representation and hook line, I think, is on point. I think that the clarity then is just when you're trying to capture that deeper orientation, because the deeper orientation requires that the sacrum move and the lumbar spine moves. Okay. When you have the earlier representation where I have ilium forward and still a sacral counter nutation, that's that late representation where I'm pushing the base of the sacrum, right, forward. Okay, that's not the same as capturing that deep orientation. Okay, one's late up at the top at the squat and early down at the bottom. Okay, you see it?
Yeah, that clarifies it a lot. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions?
I got one more. Is that okay?
We got time. Go.
Okay. So differentiating, so cable chops, like I've been playing around and I love that. And I always think of that for like wide ISAs or unloading them, right? For expansion and a little bit of rotation. But like you used it in a narrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the thought process? Is it the same? Is the goal different or is it the same?
They're not going to be the same. Okay. It looks like the same on the outside, but think about foot orientation and then helical angle that you're going to be performing the chops on. Okay. So for a narrow representation, they have a steeper helical angle. So your foot orientation is going to be different. The angle of pull is going to be different, but we're using it to capture. In both cases, we're going to try to capture the early representation. So again, it's like what I'm using that for is not the archetype per se. It is to capture the early representation of propulsion, because both archetypes can have that limitation. So I'm using the exercise to capture that. But now think about how you would orient it a little bit differently, where with the wide representation, I might have a foot spacing that looks like that. And for the narrow, I might look like that, right? Because it's going to be a steeper helical angle. And then I have a cable now that I have to create the representation of. It's like, what angle am I going to pull on? So for my wide ISA, my angle might be a little bit flatter. And for my narrow ISA, it might be a little bit steeper. So yes, it's the same exercise by name, but not the same representation in the execution. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
There you go. So again, it's like, what am I trying to do from an intention standpoint is I need early representation. Then I consider the archetype as to, okay, how do I execute this same exercise for two different? So I can literally write. So if I have a group of athletes, right, like just say you got 5 guys that you're trying to capture early propulsive strategy, right? Okay. And 3 of them are wides, 2 of them are narrow. I write the same program, but the execution is different. It's like for these 2 guys, I'm gonna use the steeper angle, shorter stagger. You see where we're going with this?
Yeah.
Because they have the ability to produce a tighter turn, where my wide guys are doing this really flat, kind of thing. They don't have the rotation available to them. So I have to use the flatter angles.
That makes programming a little bit easier for sure.
Well, it does, because again, it's like the understanding of number 1, what is represented, number 2, what is the intention, and then you can fall back on your archetypes and you say, oh, so when I pick this exercise, I just need to consider how this is executed. Because the minute I put a wide guy on too steep of an angle, maybe you get a favorable response, but maybe it's not as good as it could have been, right? So we're talking about refining how you're executing this stuff, because we can be so much better, as far as achieving the desired outcome.
Absolutely, for sure.
All right, man.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Great questions, because I don't think that you're the only one that has these questions, right? Yeah. So again, I appreciate you very much for doing this.
I appreciate you. Oh my gosh.
All right, man. You have a great weekend.
Yes, you too.
Bye now.